Thank you very much for all these important statements from the artists, curators, and culture experts. Now, moving on, we are going to have our panel discussion of today, talking about the very important issues revolving around institutions as resistance. Joining us today are four distinguished panelists. Timea Junghaus, art historian, curator, executive director of European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. Elisabet Goula, Sardà, head of debates at CCCB in Barcelona. And we have Hrag Vartanian, editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic, art critic, curator, artist, and lecturer. Last but not least, we have Gitte Zschoch, the General Secretary of EVA, Institute for Foreign Cultural Relations. To start with this conversation, I would like to ask each panelist a question before we move on to a group discussion. So first of all, I would like to ask Timea, in your experience, institutions in general, are they facing greater pressure today? And would there be specific circumstances for certain kind of institutions that they are facing even greater pressure?
Yes, hello. Welcome to fellow panelists, and thank you for the invitation and moderation. Yes, I believe that institutions of political and cultural resistance today are certainly under more pressure. And those working for a more diverse and inclusive artwork certainly do need more alliances. Let's not forget that we all operate in a crisis of epistemologies and information, and in a growing disinformation and influence by far-right, violent, and military forces. Alliances, I believe, are more important than ever. I bring, of course, the example of the Roma community, the largest European minority of 12 million people, and we have been contributing to Europe for over a millennia. And our history in Europe is a series of larger and smaller genocides, while our culture is a contribution to all national cultures and to the whole Europe as well. Our music made it to classical music, our language is in every European national language, our knowledge about the universe, spirituality, and expertise about the planet and nature. It has been taken. Our cultural heritage is stolen and hidden. And our institutions of resistance are very few. One of them is ERIAC, which was only established in 2017. I would like to share the most important, which is ERIAC represents a strategy that has been built and distilled for decades by the Roma community. And this strategy is resistant institutions need strategies for infrastructure, need strategies for delinking from the history that was taught to us and to write our own history and language. And number three is it's important in resistance strategies to have the self-determination and leadership with those who are represented.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your sharing. And then I would like to invite Elisabet. I'm curious about the work you do. Can you share with us about your views on the importance in curating constructive debates and your experiences in your work, and also what makes a constructive dialogue that can help institutions to foster their alliances and also in a form of resistance?
Thank you, Vivienne, for the introduction and the moderation, and thank you, Artists at Risk and ZKM, for making this event possible. Okay, I think that the debates program are really important, a really important piece for fighting discrimination and for defending freedom of expression. I I think that cultural centers, I work at a cultural center, and I think that cultural centers have an importance and a power to intervene in the public sphere and to create opinion. So debates programs are a key aspect of this. I think that there are many different issues that are important in having these debates in the current context of rising authoritarianism. I would say that first of all is that debates programs are very useful to make visible what it is not visible. So we have a responsibility to give a platform for voices that are not visible in the media. Then I would say that a very important aspect of our work today is breaking the simplification and the polarization of discourses that are specific of the context of discrimination and persecution. So when a situation of persecution to certain communities arrives, it arrives after a long way of simplification of the discourse, stereotyping certain communities. So there is a very important work today, and especially in a context of media crisis and a disinformation context, very increased by social networks. I think that creating debates where this simplification is broken and we can make visible how complex society is, how diverse it is, how many ways of living, how many opinions are there. So I think that debates programs are key to make visible this and to enrich, to continue to enrich a public sphere against a context that wants us to reduce to a black or white situation. So I would say that in this sense, the work that we do at the CCCB, but in many other places, is so important in this sense to keep defending and to make visible how diverse our society is, how many opinions there are, and try to be part of the public sphere defending this diversity. Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much, Elisabet. And I think that's a great introduction, or maybe a follow-up discussion with Hrag, because well, we are in the media industry, well, and we also write about arts and culture, all the happenings around the world. And so I'm curious to ask you, so what roles do you think that we can play as art writers, and especially now these days that there are people out there, they are unable to write and express themselves freely, or as freely as they wish to be, or like previously. So do you think that those writers in the free world are shouldered with the responsibility to speak up for these people?
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with everyone. I think as art writers, we're often really, we forget the power we have in the ability to create and continue narratives. And I think that's one thing that in the face of a lot of the stuff going on in the world right now is something that we have to give more power to or understand. And one of the things that art writers can do that I think is the most valuable is accountability. Because I think there's still a notion that art writing is just about propagating ideas that artists have or museums have, where the reality should be that art writers should be holding institutions and artists and others accountable for following through with ideas, for understanding if these ideas, if what they're doing is right or not. But at the same time, the importance of accountability is also accompanied by art writers. Really, we are trying to figure out also new narratives of redemption, by which I mean people should be allowed, institutions should be allowed to make mistakes and then fix them. And I think we're at a we're really at a very important turning point in this, because I think there's been very little attention placed on this topic. And I think as art writers, we can certainly do that because the art world, in many of our opinions, in my opinion specifically, we often can model new behaviors for society as large because we're a microcosm of society often. And that is something that I hope art writers will take more to heart. But there are other issues, of course, with art writers because there are issues of class and other things. So often art writers are picked from some of the most elite classes in our society. So there are issues of class solidarity that emerge with art writers that are not scrutinized. So the inverse of your question, I would also ask us to scrutinize art writers more and also be sure what their biases are and what our biases are, I should say, as well as looking at what we are not covering and potentially why. And when we do fall into the trap of giving voice to authoritarian regimes and doing that uncritically, it is incredibly dangerous, in my opinion. And I think what often happens increasingly is, and I am seeing new trends in societies that are quote unquote not as free, where often the tools of critical theory and other ideas are being used to instrumentalize authoritarian tendencies by talking about things like, by not respecting freedom of expression, but expecting your freedom of expression to be respected in a way that they would never respect yours in a way. And I think this is one thing where as art writers, we are at the forefront of making sure that those stories can be told, but also questioning the stories we are telling and continuing.
Very important insight, and I agree with what you said, Hrag. And then now I would like to invite Gitte to share with us about the work of the Institute and how and the importance in building global cultural relations and alliances, I think, through the work of the Institute.
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation to join this panel. Already heard quite some interesting remarks, especially how art writers can hold institutions like the one that I am heading accountable. I think we need that, and we welcome writing that looks at us critically, but also lovingly. IFA, Institute for Foreign Cultural Relations, is one of 38 organizations of cultural relations of the EU that have united in UNIC, the EU National Institutes for Culture, a network of European cultural relations organizations. And so we're one of 2 organizations in Germany. We're based in Stuttgart and Berlin that are organized in this network. And I guess one way of saying what we do is to say that we act on the intersection of art and culture engagement, maybe also, and research and foreign policy or foreign relations, as at the basis or at the core of our work is fostering cultural exchange. So we enable exchange, mobility, mutual learning across the globe. And we do this through different programs. We have one pillar of our work is in the arts. So we organize art exhibitions that tour the world. We also support artists who are invited to art shows around the world. We also have a program for artists and cultural actors and also human rights activists at risk. And we engage in mutual learning and have mobility programs to bring people together and enable also thinking and acting across borders. We strongly believe that knowing more about the world and knowing more about each other helps us to create sort of a global network of trust and understanding. Creating trust and understanding through culture is one way how you could say what we do. We're also an institution that's more than 100 years old. In the one of the artist statements before, we heard that institutions that are old have difficulty to change and adapt themselves to contemporary discourses or needs. And I find very interesting, I've only been at this organization now, at the head of the organization for 5 months, and we've started to look into our history a bit deeper. We found out that the first collection, we do have an art collection, but the first pieces that we had in 1917 was pieces of elephants. And so we've come a long way through also times when we bowed to the Nazi regime, and we also now remember both the Federal German Republic's cultural relations history, but also the East German GDRs, German Democratic Republic, art history, because we have combined archives, art archives. Yeah, so we've come a long way. And I do find myself asking these questions: how can we remain relevant? How can we address current contemporary issues and needs? And how can we evolve into an organization that that does cultural exchange, or that facilitates cultural exchange the way that it helps society and it helps artists? And maybe I'll stop here for now.
Well, thank you very much for your sharing, and I'm sure we'll come back to that during our group discussion. So moving on, I have some questions that are open to discussion among all the panelists. So I'll start with first of all these questions. We often want to know how cultural institutions can be active agents of resistance to discrimination and persecution of all kinds. Can they act in a way to counter all these tendencies, such as authoritarian, anti-democratic, eco-destructive tendencies in the society? I think during the I can talk about my observation, where I come from. I come from Hong Kong. So during the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, a lot of artists, cultural workers, they rendered helpless, feeling that there's nothing much that they could do at the time. And of course, the situation is not doesn't look good at the moment. But then that also inspired a lot of people, especially people in the cultural sector, to start to think about what they can do and what cultural institutions can do at times like these. So I would be very curious to hear what the panelists would have to say about the role of cultural institutions at times like these, I think in different specific contexts. Is anyone wants to be the first to talk about this?
I'll jump in, I guess, since no one else is jumping in first. I think it's really difficult to talk about fighting authoritarian and different kinds of types of tenets of ideas in institutions like museums or arts institutions when they're often not governed democratically and not modeling the same kind of behavior they want to see in the world. And I think that is one of the biggest obstacles, and particularly in the case of North America, institutions have become increasingly more elitist. Art museums in particular have become increasingly more elitist, depending more on private funding and more on these different things. And that the mission of being more democratic, fighting some of these ideas and being places of resistance is really coming under fire. So the real work is often being done by smaller organizations. And I think this is really the key, in my opinion, is not trying to necessarily reform the larger institutions, but modeling new possibilities to then be co-opted by larger institutions, which unfortunately is the way change often happens. So I do think we have to think a little bit about institutions in general that way.
Yes, please.
Perhaps I continue what Hrag began already with the criticism or critique of majority institutions. And I also think that we must also be supportive and recognize that a kind of self-reflection is happening with the decolonial movement and with the gentle rereading of European history and the contributions of minorities, and also going down to the local and considering the local communities around the institutions. But we are still a long way from these institutions becoming aware of their bias towards minorities, colored individuals, and the other minorities. So I believe that this kind of conscious and unconscious bias is still to be learned by majority institutions, and this also means that these organizations need to catch their culture of oppressive practices, and they need to be able to recognize this in their practices, which is a long-term process again, if we haven't had enough long-term change already in our on our plate. And finally, I believe that this kind of education, our own education on the cultures of catching oppressive practices, from aggressions to microaggressions to over-talking to different practices that we are not even aware of in majority institutions, extremely important to change how majority institutions really become sensitive towards art and artists at risk, artists of minority background, artists of refugee backgrounds. So, and with all this, I would like to bring back the very notion of quotas. I'm really sorry that I mention it, but I believe quotas, are still a solution when it comes to women's representation and minority representation in majority spaces. I just gave answer to the first question, Vivienne, because I don't want to take the floor from the others.
That's okay. Well, but and I think so both Elisabet and Gitte have something to contribute to. Yes. Thank you.
I agree that that there is an important debate to make around institutions. The CCCB itself is a big institution, and we have been through a debate about how to change. Of course, there are aspects of institutions that are difficult to change from the inside because we depend on other political instances that we cannot change. For instance, the CCCB is a 100% public institution, so we depend on different councils and regional political levels. But there are things that can be done, and the first was at the CCCB to recognize that cultural institutions cannot work anymore as kind of sanctuaries of knowledge apart of the communities or the local roots. So one of the first steps we took was really to reinforce a lot our local roots with many community programs. So to know better, to open the institution and to know better who is living around us, and also to make the institution not a place only for only public, and let's say probably an middle up class that wants some entertainment for the weekend, but to open the institution for all the publics, to mix the publics. And this is very important. And we work a lot in mediation and education programs to make this possible, so that the institution became a place where people coming from very different backgrounds can feel good, can be a place for them. They can undertake activities that they would be interested, and they feel that the institution is a place where they can follow their interests. So, and that you can mix these very different publics. So at the CCCB, we have been, for instance, working with, we have exhibitions that can interest to many different publics, but at the same time, we are working with young migrants that just arrive to Spain and that have no families, no roots there. So we work with them, or we work with other communities that are in our neighborhood. So I think that somehow, and of course many other things have to be changed, but somehow part of the problem is solved when you decide to open the institution in this way, I think.
Right. Thank you very much, Elisabet. And yes, Gitte.
Thanks. Yeah, as an internationally active organization, I also do think we have a responsibility in our programming to create safe spaces, or spaces where critical voices can be heard, or where critical voices are invited. And I think the fact that we act on this intersection between politics and diplomacy and interstate conversations and the cultural sector and people-to-people relations, we do have a role that enables us to create those safe spaces and to create programs where in certain areas or countries where oppression is, the question was discrimination and persecution, in spaces like that. So we can create, or we can have programs that support those that are persecuted in other countries. But I also do agree that we need to look inward, and that we need to start with ourselves and look at how we're governed, or how we as an organization, as an institution, how we act. And I think what's important we're privately organized, but we're publicly funded. And I think those programs that are most successful in anti-discriminatory practices or creating those safe spaces are those where our funders and us ourselves in our conversations with partners from all over the world, where we work to go towards the same goals, and where we sort of strengthen or work towards the same values, like protecting and or creating opportunities for those at risk. And I think these alliances are important, and I also think that we need to look at political actors and hold them accountable as well, and find those that support us in our needs and strengthen those, because they do exist. If you look at the EU's ministries of foreign affairs, there are a lot of them that say we need to strengthen civil society, for instance, because it's in civil society organizations that important discourses happen, and where ideas come about, and where change comes about. And we need to find those and then connect ourselves with those. And I think the other thing is alliances in the broader spectrum, because I sometimes think, I look at my organization and I think, wow, there are so many needs, and how can we we're well funded, but we're also small. How can we sort of find other organizations that to double our forces, or triple or quadruple them, so that we can actually achieve change? And I think the times of competition in that sense are over. I think we need to work together better and join forces. And what I find really interesting is, now that I meet people from other organizations, it's very easy to see those who want to enable that change and want to move forward and unlearn and learn new things inside and outside organizations. And I hope to come into a spirit with those of cooperation and collaboration. And and I think I also see that an organization that's 100 years old, I see a lot of super interesting people inside these organizations that would all agree with you. And yet, when you look at the larger picture of the institution, it seems hard to enable change. But as others have said before, I think we need to look inwards. That's why we're starting with our history, because that opens up a process of talking about identity. And I think once you connect with that, you can also sort of move into the future with a different perspective, maybe, and hopefully values that align with those that with the colleagues here in the room have lined out.
Great, thank you very much. And judging from the answers from all our panelists, it sounds like there are various layers of conversation that we need to get into. And say, for example, it sounds like the funding can be an issue. Because if you rely so much on government funding or private funding or particular sources, then it might limit or restrict how an institution may function or perform the kind of functions that people would expect it to perform. And so do we need a new kind of funding model for smaller, more agile organizations that can perform grassroots initiatives and connect all these smaller agile organizations with larger institutions, which can take the conversation or the initiatives further and connect them with other institutions abroad. And perhaps maybe these days with the technological development and a different kind of fundraising model, such as through crypto, the DAO, and maybe these things can change. Maybe we are looking at a very different future ahead for institutions around the world to make connection and to form alliances. What do you think? Any? Yes. Yeah.
My community, the Roma community in Europe, is a transnational community. And ERIAC actually acts prefiguratively, if you wish to say, performing some kind of European Roma cultural ministry. This prefigurative action brings real alliances, both with politics, cultural diplomacy, and the members of the community in many locations. This enables us, while we have a small association as a founding document, this enables us, of course, to also do sufficient fundraising for our activities. And we haven't mentioned in this discussion yet, but the prefigurative is best done by excellent artists. So this notion of Roma art that facilitates our relationships with the cultural world, with the art world, and with the political world is an excellent vehicle to gather attention, visibility around, and gather assemblies and people and more support for this prefigurative Roma MoMA, Roma Museum of the World, or Roma or alliances for a more equal European culture where Roma are better represented. So I believe that this is a dynamics in which communities are learning how to perform their desires towards cultural diplomacy, donors, and the national funding level, and also national funding streams and international funding streams are becoming more aware of the necessity of funding not just national cultural institutions, but also the transnational level.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Elisabet, yes.
Okay. No, thank you. No, I wanted to say that relating to founding, of course, when we talk about institutions, we have so many different types of institutions that we cannot say something that it's common to all of them. I mean, we have different types of funding, of size of institutions, or independent, not independent, public, private. So I think that what is interesting is that each kind of institution has different kind of possibilities and at the same time different type of constraints. And I think that this is interesting in the terms that making alliances with other institutions that are of different type opens the range of possibilities of things that can be done. For instance, the CCCB is a big institution, is a public institution. So we have the infrastructure to make big things, but somehow we are also slow. Our administration is not quick. So we have some possibilities that are good, for instance, to help small other institutions, small projects that need funding or need infrastructure. So I think that what's interesting is to find this kind of alliances where everybody can bring what is strong and can help to level the constraints that the other has. I think that this helps to make alliances strong.
Right, thank you, Hrag. Did you have something that you wanted to say?
Yes. Well, funding is one of those topics that I'd love to go endlessly on about, only because I think it's so foundational and important to all the work that we're doing. And I think one of the books I keep referring back to is The Revolution Will Not Be Funded by Insight, which is a radical feminists of color publication, because they sort of talk about how movements are often need to think outside of nonprofit models, which still dominate the space around this conversation. And I think membership models should be much more central to this conversation, hopefully, because I think, and I can speak best about art museums and art institutions, they are really hurt by the fact that they are collecting luxury art objects, which demands a certain type of funding from a certain sector of society, for instance, by which I mean the super wealthy. And so that creates a dynamic that means that institutions will always be beholden to a certain elite that has values that may not align with what the public will is. And I think that's the conversation that's very uncomfortable, particularly in art circles, because I think the notion of the luxury art object is still very central for many people about how cultural production is circulated, created, and stored. And I think we have to think about that if we're going to get beyond some of these issues we're talking about, is talking about pushing membership in organizations, thinking outside of everything being a nonprofit. And I think the diversity of models would be a strength around this question. And I think right now we're seeing that certain models are being pushed more and more. And I think it's creating a bit of a monoculture, honestly, in our fields, by which they're still reproducing many of the same biases that we're trying to fight against, because we're not taking in the potential for new types of models. And I say that, and at the same time, you know, there are a lot of crowdsourcing platforms that have been very popular in the last decade that have allowed projects to happen and be made in ways all around the world that would have never been able to be made before. And with them come a built-in audience through the people supporting the project, which is a very unique phenomenon, honestly, in contemporary cultural production. So I think we have to start looking at these newer models and engage with them rather than reject them and sort of poo-poo them because they don't fit what our traditional ideas of what culture and culture institutions can do.
Right. I see that there's this trend of changing in I guess maybe much more in the crypto world, that there's a diversity of different kinds of funding model that may give, you know, greater autonomy to different kinds of organizations. And so I would like to hear your view, Gitte.
Thank you. Yeah, another thing that I would like to mention when we talk about funding is that in the public eye, what has been the paradigm behind funding is austerity. So in Germany, we have to get 3 different sort of offers, and then we compare, and then we choose the cheapest usually, and that is binding so many resources because I understand, of course, we want to use public money very wisely, and at the same time, I know that people who are in the public, who work in the public area, they do have a sense of responsibility, and so I think that the only measure that we use in our spending is if it's sort of economical, is, to me, is not contemporary anymore. I think we need to use other standards of deciding how we use our money. For instance, if we use the money in a sustainable way, if we sort of protect the environment, if we have a regional focus, if we also use care in how we treat our partners, like the artists that we work with, or our own colleagues who, work in precarious situations sometimes. And one of the examples where this becomes very apparent is in residency programs that are still based around one single person traveling to a different place, and where family situations are not being taken into account. But others agree, is about food that we eat when we make productions. Can it be locally sourced, and can it be organic, or does it have to be the best offer, sort of? And I hope that public funding that there's a revolution in a way, in the way that public funding can be spent. And maybe I'm all for transparency also, but I think that our systems, and I'm glad that we have public funding, because I think with private funding, I see the same obstacles that Hrag has outlined. Because with public funding, or with private funding, then there are no one who holds you accountable with how you spend it, except the donors, who often come from very particular strata of society. So,
yeah, that we're looking at various types of challenges, but then but I also wonder now with the technological developments, and especially the kind of the accelerating development that we have experienced over the past couple of years because of the pandemic, how this can actually help institutions to form alliances and make connections around the world. It seems that it's true that we might be unable to travel as easy as before, but then the technologies have allowed us to connect with each other so much easier, like what we are doing today here in this panel discussion in the virtual space. Do you think this is actually helping institutions to form alliances with partners, potential collaborators that formerly you didn't have a chance to work with before? Do you have any experiences or insights that you could share with us? Oh, yes, Gitte.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what we see during the pandemic is that there's an openness to using online conference tools like this one, or other instruments that allow connection beyond borders on a global scale, that the willingness to use them and to have meaningful experiences in them or through them or with them has increased. And so we've, as IFA, together with the British Council, we founded a network of cultural relations research organizations or individuals, ICRA, International Cultural Relations Research Alliance. So that's a very particular sort of focus of colleagues around the world who study and dissect and analyze cultural relations from different countries, but also other levels perspective. And this network connects not only Western European countries where cultural relations have a longer history than in other places of the world, but it connects them with individuals from other countries, including the so-called Global South as well. And I think this has been accelerated by this digital shift that we've seen during the pandemic. At the same time, I also think that we don't leverage it well enough in terms of sort of campaign building, for instance, but it's a start.
Great, any other thoughts? Yes.
Yes, I also would like to reflect on the pandemic. So during the pandemic, with the digital shift, our organization, for example, was able to reach through a really naive, to be honest, initiative of family music competition. You know, our community basically is very fluent in music. So we had a family music competition, and we reached to 5 million Europeans through our family music competition online, while we had 4,000 likes on Facebook when the pandemic started in March 2021. So this gigantic leap in reaching the community brought us a lot of solutions in our social media and advertising and promotion reaching the community. At the same time, we became more aware of other technological solutions, as you mentioned, crypto, and even the potential use of NFTs in reclaiming or re-establishing our lost or damaged cultural heritage, or cultural heritage that's currently in inaccessible archives and unreachable for my community. But at the same time, I would like to go back to what Elisabet said about the need to complexify discourses. So this hype of technology also needs complexification, and Gitte very rightly so mentioned our need to be more sensitive to artists and collaborators and colleagues who are coming from precarious circumstances. So these two inspirations today bring me the notion that it's extremely important for us to complexify this hype and this discourse of growing technology around us, and our desire to be more fluent in this uncertainty of technology by being more sensitive to how this creates a group or a community of the irrelevant people who are not able to keep up, irrelevant communities who will not have the access because there's communities where there's no electricity in Europe, and there's communities without internet access or computer access. This is hard to imagine, but this exists even in several locations in Central and Eastern and Southern Europe. So I hope that the artwork will also distill or produce a sensitive discourse on how the technology creates apathy towards these groups and communities.
Right, and Elisabet had something to respond.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to say that I totally agree what you were saying, Timea. I think that digital, what has happened during the pandemic and the turn to digital cultural alliances, it's important, of course, and we have made a step that probably won't be back. But I think that another thing that we have seen during the pandemic, it's a terribly growth of precarity and poverty, and all over Europe. I mean, in Spain, in Catalonia, there is a high increase of poverty. And of course, there is a digital gap. So if we turn everything to digital, if we rely only our alliances on the digital, there are communities that are lost. I mean, I think that it's very important to keep the presential, to keep the physical contact of culture alive, and to continue to make the physical place of cultural encounter, to continue to keep them alive, because many people, and with the pandemic still more people, cannot reach this digital gap, and they cannot to take part of this new digital cultural and tour. So I think it is very important to keep an eye and to keep watching what happens to the most vulnerable communities with this digital shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hrag, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with so many of these comments. I think the pandemic has brought the realization of many organizations that were resistant to it, the fact that physical space isn't as important as maybe they initially thought. While I agree that physical space is also incredibly important, I think we have to be very hesitant about technology in general and use a very healthy dose of being cynical about it, only because technology, as much as it allows us to be more visible, it can also create scenarios where we disappear. And I mean that in a real way, by which I mean that, you know, we've seen, for instance, in the way the Chinese government has used the turning the screws of technology so that it's not full-blown censorship, but perhaps slowing down the internet, creating other systems that create disruptions. The other thing is we've also seen instances like where Facebook helped the genocide of the Rohingya, by just being a platform that allows for certain opinions to go unfettered. But then it also, we've reported, for instance, when it comes to, for instance, various issues around Kurdish identity and culture in Turkey, where, the Turkish state media has actually said there were riots in cities that riots didn't exist. So I'm using that in terms of where technology can also create a false sense of knowledge that is against everything art and artistic production and culture represents. And I think we have to be really careful about that. So as much as technology should be a source of a lot of these new solutions, they also come with the exact same biases we've been dealing with. And I think the illusion, because of people's media literacy, which is not very high, unfortunately, and in the art world where we think we're visual and we should know these things, it's not. It's actually, visual literacy is actually some of the worst. I have to say, to be quite frank, for instance, in our own publication, we stopped publishing satire that's not on April Fools because people couldn't figure out that they were jokes, as an example. So, and I use that as also just to sort of caution us to know that technology is going to help some solutions, but it's not a panacea, and it actually creates new problems, whether it's of access and even the ability to speak in a language that other people understand. I mean, these are all real problems that we still haven't gotten over.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like technology, on the one hand, it really opens up a new horizon to a lot of us, but there's also a double-edged sword that needs to be treated with caution. I think to follow up, and one last question before we conclude this panel discussion is, I think in terms of the roles of institutions, in times of crises, how is it possible for institutions to be activated and to create pressure on governments? Is this something that institutions can do, or possible for them to do in these day and age?
If it's all right, I'll start, because I have an example that we've been trying to push for the last few years in the US specifically, which is the sanctuary movement, which is a movement that we're trying to push art institutions specifically to become places of sanctuary, particularly for undocumented and people who are in crisis. And I will tell you that it has been one of the hardest things I've ever, because it's not that institutions don't want to do this, but there is an inertia that we can't seem to understand how institutions could take on these ideas and actually incorporate them. So what does this mean about sanctuary movement? It means that if there's a crisis, an institution should be a place where people can go and get accurate information, find safety from potential, raids, things that might jeopardize their own safety. And institutions don't want to get involved. And they just have refused to really incorporate this beyond some of the smallest institutions. And it seems on paper, these should be things that arts institutions should be aligned with, but there is absolutely no will at the board level to push some of these things. So I would love to think that that could be a way, for instance, like something that seems very basic, but institutions have been fully resistant to this idea for some reason.
Anyone, any other panelists have anything to add and share? Timea?
Perhaps the case of the minority that I have the privilege to work with has a very specific strategy. While we are negotiating with the states, European member states, and also states of the European continent, and we are negotiating also with the European Union and the Council of Europe for cultural recognition of the Roma minority and for funding. At the same time, Roma are the only one growing population of Europe at the moment, and it is I would like to go back to what Hrag said, that the real space is still extremely important. The assemblies of the Roma bodies in space and in the public space is one of our most important strategies of changing the oppression, changing the minds of governments, of political systems, and also transnational structures. I mentioned a few locations. Next to Skopje, Shutkas, 30,000 Roma people in one community with a Roma mayor. I mentioned Sevilla, Poligono del Sur, 40,000 Roma people in the suburb of Sevilla. I can mention several settlements in Central and Eastern Europe or the Balkans. Just for example, in Serbia, we are currently helping 700 Roma musicians, and there's thousands of Roma musicians. So this is only the best who have applied for COVID support after the pandemic with us. So 700 musicians who've been supported out of thousands of musicians in one Balkans country. This means that the assembly, the actual presence of Roma bodies in the public space is an extremely strong negotiation tool, and it's growing in the future.
Right. Thank you very much, Timea. And Gitte?
Yeah, I do think that as institutions, we do have the privilege of influence, I guess, that other organizations, grassroots, civil society might not have or have in a different way. And I wonder if we're often aware of that and if we use it to the right ends. For example, we can talk to politicians maybe more easily than others. And I think this is not necessarily something that happens in the public, but when, I mean, again, I've been in conversations with the mayor of the city that where we're based at, and just by making certain points about what we think is important in sort of looking at history, for instance, or by supporting other organizations in the city that do important work and sort of actively saying that again and again also, I do think that through that you can have a certain influence. And I mean, everyone can go talk to politicians in our democracies and make cases. So I think this is something that shouldn't be forgotten. At the same time, I also agree, bodies and spaces, as Timea has said, is important. And again, working with other organizations and talking to each other and finding common, common ideas, common ground. Because, for example, when the program that we, the Martin Roth Initiative, this program that we do together with the Goethe Institute, supported by the German Foreign Office, that supports artists at risk on a global scale, was funded only a few years ago. It was a new program. And I think there was generally the idea in the German public or among German cultural institutions that this is needed. And so it is an example of joint efforts, convincing or finding the right political actors to do programs like that with. But I also want to say something on what Hrag said, boards and how institutions are governed today. I think, I'm not sure if we need to change the entire system, but I definitely think we need your help as writers and journalists to look critically at our structures that are sort of above this operational level. I think there's good practice, you know, when that level sort of supports you in change in a pushing, but also loving or caring way. But I also see that, and at least in Germany, we're at a turning point in a way where the old model was that those structures have sort of, there was no change, for instance. People stayed in these boards for many, many years. And there's also this question of, is it rewarded or not, or is it seen as something that you do on the side, like as Ehrenamt, as sort of free of charge? Because that attracts certain people who can afford to do this job, and then maybe they're retired, and so they have different ways of interacting with society today. And so I think to leverage the power of these sort of boards and circles that are outside the operational structure could be powerful. And yet it's not so easy. But again, hold us accountable, please.
Right, and Elisabet.
Yes, I certainly think that institutions can intervene in the public sphere and that they have power in this sense. I mean, I said at the beginning of this panel that in the case of debate program, but any program in a cultural institution, I think that has the power to interfere in the public debates, and this is a strong power. And I think that institutions must think about the values and the ideas that they want to be in their agenda as cultural institutions. No, so in this sense, questions such as equality, fighting against any discrimination. I mean, all these things must be in the agenda of cultural institutions, because they have, with many kind of activities, the power to make them more visible. And then in other circumstances, it must happen that they might have some direct political connections, and they might use it. It is not my case that we have been in many circumstances, but for instance, last summer, we precisely worked with Artists at Risk to help, to try to help some Afghan artists to leave the country. So in this case, we worked with political instances to try to make this possible. So I think that there are certain circumstances in which maybe this direct dialogue between a cultural institution and a political level might happen. But I think that the most important task we have is to create and to create opinion, to create a state of a debate, of a public debate, which is a first step to guarantee that societies keep to be more democratic.
Great, thank you very much, Elisabet, and thank you so much for all the panelists joining us today. Just one final question before we conclude this panel discussion. So how can institutions support other institutions at risk? Can we have short answers from each panelist so that our audiences can be a great takeaway from this panel discussion? So anyone wants to go first?
I'll just say something really quickly. I'll say, I think by sometimes getting out of the way of the work, sometimes institutions have a way of getting in the way. So I'll just say that's first, but second, also just offering consultation and resources in terms of specialized knowledge. I think institutions underestimate how much specialized knowledge and professional knowledge they have within their walls. And I think that is often something really useful, and sharing those networks and knowledge with other institutions at risk.
Thank you. Yes.
May I?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we can, and I want to encourage everyone to reach out to us. I also think that because I agree with what Hrag said, we do also just having information and being able to support in navigating the political and the artistic, and maybe also the funding fields. Yes, so do reach out to us. At the same time, I think looking inwards, I think institutions, and my own included, we need to not do too much so that that work, of supporting others does not feel like extra. There's a tendency in institutions to always do too much. And so whenever there's something new that comes along, there's like, we can't, we're too full. And we are also people, I mean, and I think, I see also my role in saying, please keep like 10 or 20% needs to be sort of open for negotiation so that we can react. And I wonder if now, at this big transitional movement and disruptive movement that we're in, with climate crisis and other crises, that maybe this is something new for institutions or more relevant than before?
Great, thank you. And Timea.
Yes, I think that on the peripheries, we have a very advanced consciousness that there is no competition any longer and the peripheries are united. At the same time, at this time that institutions with privileges share or give up these privileges so that artists at risks, communities at risks can participate. It's very short. You asked for very short. So if it sounds a bit simplified, I apologize. I don't want to take more time.
Well, thank you so much. And Elisabet.
Yes, I totally agree with what has been said. I just wanted to add that I have seen a big change in this in the last years. I think that now collaboration between institutions is much more natural than a few years ago. I think that it remains a very important part of our work to talk with other institutions to see how we can to make alliances and to make projects together. So I think that there is a big change in this sense. So I'm sure that it's going to be a trend for the next years to be in collaboration always with other institutions, I think. And I totally agree with Gitte that we have to keep some space for other activities to be possible, not to fool our schedules, which is also that happens to us many often.
Great. Well, thank you so much for our distinguished panelists joining us today and this really inspiring and thoughtful discussion that gives us a lot of food for thought. So to conclude this section, we'll have an artistic intervention, a music and visual piece titled Empty House by Leila Yanisa. So thank you very much for tuning in today, and we will hope to see you again very soon.